To introduce myself, I come from a very linguistic anthropology background, studying in the American tradition of linguistic anthropology. I'll be going into that a little bit. My presentation is called Anthropological Perspectives on Language Learning. Whorf, Benjamin Lee Whorf, Cryptotypes, and Relativity. In the past, people at the Polyglot conference, our lovely event here, have talked about Whorf and relativity and language learning in that respect. But they, in my opinion, they've been missing quite a bit of the big picture. So I'm going to present my side, and you can tell me what you think after the presentation. So I'm going to look at linguistic anthropology, just some scholars, different scholars from the field of anthropology historically, some modern figures, and we're going to talk about how their theories can be applied to our language learning to reach native-like or very high proficiency in our target language. So I want to come out a little bit from the podium and talk about, let me see if this is working. Wonderful. So what is linguistic anthropology, first of all? I want to look at what is linguistic anthropology. Basically, we have a lot of text here. I'm going to try to speed through it a little bit just so we can have enough time for Q&A. But basically, it's looking at, it's one of the 4 branches of anthropology in America. We have biological anthropology, sociocultural, and archaeology. It's split into 4 subsets. And to make it short, it's talking about how language affects culture. Talking about how language and culture are intertwined, how they affect how you think. And so all the research that is done on it is it's very qualitative. It's in the field, people who speak the language, interviewing natives, in that language, talking about certain things with them, observing what they do and making interpretations on the culture. So that's basically the main thing that we need to know here. And of course, we do use a lot of findings that are used in scientific linguistics, grammatical, more grammatical and morphological forms. That is used in linguistic anthropology, but talking about how language is used in practice. So that's just a quick overview of what linguistic anthropology is as an American field of study. Now, the boring stuff, I went through it very quickly. Now we're going to get into some of the more interesting stuff. First of all, this man, very interesting guy, named Franz Boas. Before we go into Whorf, I want to make sure that we understand, what led up to the theories of linguistic relativity, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. But first, we want to look over the history a little bit. So, there's this man named Franz Boas. You could see him here in the top picture as a strapping young lad, very nice curly hair here. Here, he's a strapping old man with a very curly mustache. So, basically what his story is. He was a German, educated man, learned hard sciences, focused on that. He took a geography class. And he noticed that because everyone was focusing on cultural geography at the time, looking at how the field of cultural geography could explain differences in rising xenophobia and anti-Semitism in Europe at that time. So he decided to come to the US. And he did a lot of research looking at German-born children, German-American children of German immigrants, and children born and raised in Germany. And he basically concluded something not profound to us, that language or culture and people's ability to succeed in life is not based on your blood or your ethnicity. It's really your material surroundings, what you had growing up, and things like that. He also had to battle a bit of racist science, saying that cultures all have their own historical point, which led them to where they are in the present. So you can't say it's just basically some superiority, like white superiority or something like that. It's all about where you, what culture you grew up in and what the history of your culture group is. So he looked at a lot of Native American languages too. That will be more relevant soon. And he helped formally establish the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. The next person in the line, oh wait, no, this is important. So, you might be saying, Angelo, I came to learn about linguistics and linguistic anthropology. Why are you showing me a half-naked man dancing in a hula hoop? So, this is actually him posing at the American Museum of Natural History. He went out and studied a lot of cultures and brought back different items and clothing and different things, and he posed for exhibits that they were going to put in the museum, some of which are still there in New York City today. So, just a little bit of fact. The next one in the line, Edward Sapir. So he, a student of Boas's, also German-born or Prussian-born at that time, I like to choose this picture because he sort of looks like Superman, ready to save the day of languages here. So he helped establish the field of linguistics in the U.S. He was a student of Boas's at Columbia University, and he tied linguistics and linguistic forms to anthropology, to culture, to the way that people actually use language in practice, not just forms, as opposed to his contemporary Leonard Bloomfield, who focused more on structural linguistics, grammatical forms, as the main thing to study, the most important part of language. So that was the difference between those two. Following on the Boasian tradition, he also looked at Native American languages. He looked at the differences, in Native American languages and theorized about the connection between language and culture that way. Side note, he was also interested in the idea of a neutral international buffer language for communication. An international language for communication. I wonder what that could be. I don't really, you tell me if you can think of anything. Oh, okay. So, the next one in the line. So we have Edward Sapir, Franz Boas and Edward Sapir so far, just some founding figures. The next one, Benjamin Lee Whorf. So you remember the title? Yeah, it's that one. So Whorf, an important thing to know about Whorf. He was Sapir's student at Yale. So Sapir went on to become a professor at Yale, and Whorf was his student. On the side, as a part-time job, he worked as a fire insurance inspector. Very strange job for a college student to do, but at the time, he was looking at claims of fire insurance to see who would get paid and who not. He noticed a couple of interesting things that tied into his studies. First of all, we look at, he has an example that he gives in his writings of the empty barrels. So he was working at a chemical processing plant. He did an inspection of a fire at a chemical processing plant. The story of this goes that an employee working there, he was going on break. He decided to get a cigarette, to go for a smoking break, and he goes next to a barrel that has the word empty written on it. So empty. Now, if you think empty, you might think, oh, there's nothing in it, it doesn't do anything, it's just useless, no problem, I can smoke here. Well, the problem with that, once he smokes and he kicks the stub out of his fingers, what happens exactly? Well, an explosion. So things catch on fire and an explosion happens. What his connection with that was, what he realized with language, is that in that specific company, empty didn't necessarily mean empty. It actually meant that the materials that were supposed to go in that barrel were not in it. So it didn't matter what anything else in the barrel was. It doesn't matter if it was a liquid, like a liquid remains. It didn't matter if it was a gas. Well, those barrels were actually filled with a highly explosive gas, which could have been left over from the chemical processes. Another example he gives, limestone. So he worked at a wood processing plant after a fire, a wood processing plant. And all the machines were insulated with limestone. And when limestone comes into contact with acetic acid, I'm not going to go into too much chemistry here, that's not my specialization, but I'm going to give you a quick overview. When acetic acid reaches the limestone, a chemical process occurs where you get spun limestone, you get a sort of degraded form of it, and calcium acetate gets produced. And when that calcium acetate is also a flammable gas, and spun limestone after that reaction also catches fire very easily, even though if you think stone, limestone, you think it can't catch on fire. Well, the whole point of why he looks at these examples, he looks at, why are all of these people, they see the words, they see what they might mean, and they look at them and think, oh, well, this must mean that, therefore I can do this, or therefore I can't do that. What that is actually talking about here is that language actually affects how we do things in the world. So it affects how we do things based on how we think, so we'll get more into that. Of course, following Boas and Sapir, he also became very interested in Hopi, a Native American language among some others, and we'll get more into that in a little bit. He never became an academic, but he went much farther with Sapir's ideas of language and culture. He created more theories, did a lot of writing on that. So he basically said that languages don't really speak to universals, like all humans do this, because all languages have this. Rather, languages speak to different ways of looking at the world, different ways of thinking about certain things, topics like time, He believed that there are two aspects of language: the things that you can see on the top, and the things that you can't see that you have to look below to analyze and parse out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And basically, like I said before, tied language and culture, how they grew up together, to cognition and the way that we think. So, just a show of hands, how many people have heard of the Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis? Very good. Okay, we have this crowd. Now, you might not like what I have to say about this, but let's get to it. So, what is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis? Well, it really depends on what you mean by is. The word is needs a little unpacking because the definition of this is a little contested, let's say. So it's a term sort of put on the two. Sapir and Whorf never really jointly worked on this theory together. They never really, got together and said, okay, this is our Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Rather, it's sort of combined because the two worked on very similar things. But there are two interpretations of this hypothesis. The first one, which I argue is the less accurate one, is linguistic determinism. So what linguistic determinism is basically that language determines thought and the ability to think in certain ways. So think of it like this. Languages are prison cells. So your language, the way that you put your brain in a prison cell, and you have a ball and chain on your leg. So you can't move out of it. You're determined to think that way for the rest of your life. While the second one, which is more sort of the anthropological interpretation of it, is linguistic relativism, which is it affects your thought, but one can learn and adapt to other ways of thinking as well. It doesn't make you, because you're born a German speaker, it doesn't mean that you can only think how Germans think. There are other ways of looking at things based on other languages, of course. So the former, can also, obviously possibly come from scientific experiments done in the 50s, trying to, take pieces of his research and sort of make it into a scientific experiment, like color studies. Berlin and Kay, they looked at people from different societies and how they viewed where one color starts and the other ends, and so different color boundaries. So there's that. But a lot of these, taking single pieces, it often takes the arguments out of context, and so it often becomes sort of a straw man, like, oh, well, this piece is wrong, so therefore Whorf was wrong about everything. And it's often most challenged by, a more universalist camp, people who believe that, basically everyone in the world thinks the same exact way. Languages don't really change that. So, we're going to get into a little bit of what Whorf actually argued. We basically want to say that language shapes culture and affects cognition, making it so the language we speak also has an effect on how we think about certain concepts like time. The perfect example of this is his work with Hopi. He did research with Hopi and basically said that, Hopi doesn't think about time in an objective concept, like an objective way like we do in a lot of European languages and English, where you can almost like hold like 1 hour, like you can hold it like that and cut it into different pieces. Hopi doesn't exactly think about it that way. The way that he looked at this is looking at the difference between verb tenses and actually how Hopi uses verb endings that tell you how you know the information. So, for example, in English, you would say he is running. In Hopi, you might say wari. I'm not trained in Hopi, so excuse my pronunciation. Wari. You would say he ran. You don't know if he's there, but you don't know he's not there now, but you know that he ran. You would still say wari. If I go behind this podium and I say, I want to tell you that I can see something that you can't see, and I want to see he's running. I would still yell over the podium, "Wadi!" So I would basically tell you the same exact thing. While you would change this if you maybe he ran an hour ago and you saw him, but you still have to remember it, "Era Wadi." So you could see that based on the information that you have, how you know that information, that's how you change the verb, not how you think about the time. This, of course, is one of his main reasons for why he thinks that, if you think differently about time, this changes the way you perceive many, many different things, and that's all encoded into your language. So, again, this is not linguistic determinism. The point is that your language does not determine what you can think, it determines what you do think habitually. It doesn't determine, you can't think this, you can think that. It's all about what you normally do think, just by virtue of you being a native speaker of a certain language. So, looking at a couple different examples, Whorf also saw, in English you might say, I cleaned something with a ramrod. In Shawnee, for example, you are describing the same exact action, but you use different word foci. So here you would talk about a dry space for cleaning. You would talk about the interior of a hole if you're putting a ramrod in there, and then you use the motion described to that when you use an instrument, basically. So same action, different foci for the same thing. So another interesting thing. Here, we look at the word for, in English, for example, you would say here dragonfly, pilot, and an airplane. In Hopi, they're one word. They all describe the same thing. So you notice that there's different connections being made with the different words that exist. Same thing. You might have heard that Eskimo has 20, 50, 70, I don't know, it grows by 10 every year, words that exist for snow. At least Whorf focused on 3. The kind that is on the ground, the kind that is falling, and the kind that you can build into buildings like igloos, for example, while English only has 1 word. Hopi has 2 different words for water, the water that is found in nature, in fountains, seas, waterfalls, and the water that you can drink, while in English they're the same exact word. So basically, what these quotes are talking about here, languages, this is a big takeaway, languages are just different, they give you different ways of cutting up the world. So the same world, the same piece of, the same pie, the same round pie, just cut into different slices, different ways for looking at the same things. So, Whorf looked at languages from a variety of perspectives. He didn't just look at it in this anthropological way. He also looked at it as a, exact science. Maybe some of you are better at math. I have no idea what he's talking about here, but here he talks about in a more scientific way, how you can determine what the pronunciation of the plural S is. For example, s, so we have like cat's lips versus the z sound, like claws. You notice that the pronunciation is different. So he looks at it, through a lot of different lenses, especially in all of his writings. And of course, if you're European, you might be thinking, I've never noticed this before. Maybe you have, but if you haven't, I never noticed this before. It's something that I just never thought about. Whorf thought about something called standard average European, basically saying that European languages generally have they're kind of on the same page. There are differences between languages, but in terms of cognition and ways of thinking in languages, kind of similar. So maybe there are some outliers, but for the most part, he thought of it as a standard average European way, whereas Asian languages, African languages might think about things a lot differently. So, again, like I said, the main part of this quote here, language patterns and cultural norms have grown up together, constantly influencing each other. That's the argument that we're making here. Not that it determines the way that you can think, and that's it. So, get ready for a ride. I'm going to, give you a little bit of look into a scientific way he talked about language learning. So imagine you're diving into this machine as an English learner an English speaker learning French. You would have to, analyze your sound patterns in the language, break those down, learn the French sound patterns, assemble them, and make sure that they're all good and clean. And you would go to, morphology, syntax, grammar, do the same exact thing. So he sort of envisioned language learning as a sort of machine that you can just jump into, and then at the end you have a perfect French speaker, polished language. So the question here now, before we get into some of the main, meats and the takeaways, where have we come since Whorf? Let me poll the audience. How many of you know this man? So, all right, let me, hold on, I want to call on someone. Tell me who he is. I even call it out. Yep, there we go. Perfect. Noam Chomsky. So this is a picture that I found of him in his prime. This is a more recent picture that I found of him with a funny hat. So we have those two there. Noam Chomsky in the 50s, about the same time as Whorf, maybe a little bit after, came out with the idea of universal generative grammar, basically saying that, a child will learn a language, you can put a child anywhere, and you can just give it language input. Not even speak to it directly, but you can give it language input, and it will learn the language. It will learn to speak regardless, which is true. It has been proven, I suppose, that is true. But the conclusion that he made from that is that all languages, therefore, the differences in languages aren't very important. It's all about the hardware, the same hardware that we have, which is an argument for studying, more grammar forms and looking underneath the surface of like grammatical forms, morphological forms, etc. So at that time, relevance lost a little bit of its shine. Relativism lost a little bit of its shine. But Since then we've had some scientific studies, color words and things like that. Anthropologists are still rethinking his ideas. We have Rethinking Relativity, which is a more recent 1980s, 1990s that came out, where we can rethink of language as thought and language as thinking for speaking. So not necessarily thought and language as two separate concepts, but maybe children learn to communicate. So they think first, then they actually learn to communicate, and that actually creates the bond between language and thought that way. So just a couple of theories. Of course, I propose that in acquiring a native language, the child learns particular ways of thinking for speaking. So just to elaborate on that, on Slobin's arguments, we see here, so first of all, let me poll again. Who here speaks Spanish? Okay, good. French? Good. Turkish? German? All right, we have a lovely European bunch here. And of course, Turkic. Slobin basically says this: native speakers have no trouble with the Spanish imperfective. We would say French, but the progressive and the past and the perfect pose problems to them since they're not French ways at looking at events. We see, based on the grammar and the ways of thinking, they're a little bit different. Turkish speakers have difficulty with definite and indefinite articles in learning to speak Spanish, English, and German since there are no definite articles in Turkish. Of course, I don't speak that. You can correct me if that's wrong. German speakers of English use the progressive, where they should use the simple present. So you sort of understand what the concept is here. That because certain languages lack certain concepts, maybe because you're speaking a different language, you're putting sort of your native language's schema, your native language's system, and sort of also a lot of times culture onto a foreign language, and that is often why maybe learning a foreign language. In that language, you might sound a little bit unnatural, you might sound a little bit incorrect, grammatically, culturally, etc. So, going on to the second part of the title here, we have the cryptotype. So this is more academic speak. I will try to not go into such verbose language. A cryptotype is basically, and this is Whorf's concept here, the cryptotype. You look at language, you look at a sentence, and you say, okay, you see the subject, the verb, you see direct objects, etc. But the problem with that is that in a lot of sentences, a lot of phrases, a lot of cultural references, that stuff you can't actually find on the surface. Rather, you have to look underneath the surface here. You have to look underneath, what is on the actual paper, and by doing that, if you understand those things, you start to understand that many reasons why people say things, the reasons why many people have certain phrases, why people use sentences and certain rhetorical patterns, is because that's more getting at the culture, the history of the people there. So to be able to use that, you have to recognize that language is not simply just the words on the paper. So the examples that he gives, like he, she, it, even though they're technically not grammatically marked like Romance languages are, they actually refer to a gender. That's sort of an unprofound way of looking at it, while the use of you can say unfold, uncover, but you can't say undrink, uneat. That actually creates a very strange mental image when you try to think about that. Versus his phenotype, which is the stuff on the surface, like, I can see I run, present, I ran, past. So it's basically any linguistic feature, hidden linguistic feature, that makes you think. If someone asks you a question, you would go, why do we think about it? Why do we say this, and why do we not say that? Strange. So maybe you can think of some examples in your own language. I would love to hear during discussion. So again, the horizon of awareness is sort of the stuff on the top, and below the horizon of awareness is the cryptotype, what you can't see on the top, but you can, of course, bring it up and analyze it that way once you bring it above the horizon of awareness. So this concept is easily repurposed for language learning. Something that I like to bring up, one of my Emirati friends actually talked to me the other day, and she said, she was talking about in Dubai, there's a water park, Wild Wadi Water Park, and she said, I was there, do you like water parks? Do you like to play? And I say, play what? Looking at that, her use of that, and on the weekends I play. I'm an English teacher. I teach Chinese students, and a lot of times when they're lower level in English, they might say, I say, what did you do this weekend? Or what do you do on the weekends? They say, I play. In English, if you're not a native speaker of English, maybe in your native language that you use that form. In English, it sounds a little bit strange unless it's understood what you're talking about. That, of course, comes from the Chinese word wan, so to play or to have fun or to hang out. So another example, this is very common in dialect. So for example, if you were to say tre ceri fa, if you speak Italian, there is a place in Gubbio that has there's a place called Gubbio in Italy that has a festival called the Festa dei Ceri. It's a very big festival, holy festival, where you run around your city with 3 big statues of saints on your shoulders. And this is very important because it affects the dialect of the city. You say tre ceri fa, you can use it as a dialectal form, sometimes jokingly, to mean 3 years ago. If you didn't know that information, you'd be completely confused, even though it's technically grammatically correct. It's sort of, it makes sense on the paper, but you don't know the meaning. So, and also in English, for example, there's a lot of things that we say, native English speakers, that are ungrammatical, not technically grammatically correct, but people say them and they're considered socially correct. It's a convention that they're correct. So, for example, long time no see. That actually comes from, I believe, Chinese English, and it became a sort of more popular phrase that way. Or let's say you're wearing a tuxedo to a friend's wedding and your friend goes up to you and says, "Oh, hey buddy, you clean up nice." And it's like, you know, if you didn't know English to that level, you might be like, what the hell are you talking about? But of course, that is of course something that people actually say, and it's considered correct. Maybe your English teacher in high school might not say so, but it technically is. Looking at a couple other, relevant scholars, Vygotsky. Maybe some of you are interested in psychology. I have the solution for you. We have Vygotsky here, a Soviet psychologist who also was interested in the co-development of language and cognition and consciousness, which he thought psychologists at the time were sort of lacking. So he studied this in children. He came up with the concept of zones of proximal development. So when you're a kid, you might have you might have a low level where you can only learn so much on your own. That's the low level of the zone of proximal development. So you can only learn so much on your own. And when you're first grade, second grade, you can only learn that much. The height is with a teacher, an experienced teacher helping you all the time, and that zone sort of increases and goes up as your level does. So you're able to learn more on your own as you learn more about the language, for example. And we'll be using that a little bit more. He also looks at second language acquisition and basically says that if you learn a second language later, after you've already ingrained a sort of pattern of thinking into your mind, then you're sort of using a system of meanings and patterns of your native language and putting it on a foreign language, which is what I said before with Whorf. He did notice, however, that children growing up bilingually did sort of have they sort of learned them independently, and they had 2 patterns of thinking that were noticeable in each language. And so, us grown-ups, us adults here, he applied it to children, but how do we look at it in adults here? So, if we're looking at proximal development, here's a pretty interesting tip. So your target language ability, you have to think, are you A1, are you A2? So you have to think, this is how much I can learn, this is the max I can learn if I have a teacher or a practice partner, for example. So, I mean, maybe if you're looking at Vygotsky, you might not want to start reading Anna Karenina when you haven't even learned something basic in Russian like Yatli, etc. And of course, again, I bring up the point, become aware of your language's patterns, because compared to the pattern of your target language. So notice patterns, ways of speaking in your language, and you have to be sort of conscious of how you're applying that, because many people speak very literally from their native language into their target language if it's obviously their first or second foreign language that they're learning. Next, Wortham and the Anthropology of Education. Basically, that Wortham is a more contemporary scholar here. So we say here that Wortham looks at language learning in academic institutions and concludes that this is sort of the basis for why a lot of ideologies exist. Things about like nationalism and ideas of citizenship, what languages should be spoken, what languages shouldn't be spoken, how your language should be spoken. That's viewed in a sort of academic sense that your teachers sort of teach you that, and it's also other students sort of press you to think about language in certain ways. So he brings up the concept, a very important concept of linguistic ideology, language ideology, which is basically just preconceived notions or beliefs about language and how it connects with the social world around you, how it connects with culture. The most interesting example I have here, African American vernacular English. I was telling Richard before that I have this in my presentation. He was using it a bit on me. African American vernacular English. He gave the example of American fraternities. Maybe you've seen them in movies like Animal House. So American fraternities, people often mimic this sort of way of speaking in America in frats and a lot of other similar situations to show physical superiority and masculinity. While also, if you want want to call someone poor or less intelligent than you, then in this situation, a frat brother might call another black or something like that. Not the most savory example, but it shows how language is used to reinforce certain ideas about the world around you, different people, groups, etc. So the relevance to us, language learning ideology is a term that I like to introduce. I've been trying to coin it for quite a while now. Basically, for example, Americans saying, "Oh, I'm really scared of this language. It has a different alphabet." For maybe here, with such a diversity of language learners here, it might seem a little bit strange to say that. But Americans who aren't very used to learning languages are actually put off learning a language, let's say, if it has a different alphabet, because they think it might take a long time. It might be very scary to learn, and of course, also the target language that you're learning might also have this problem. Maybe if you're learning Russian, I experience this a lot in languages that I'm learning. If you learn Russian, maybe a Russian might speak to you and say, "Oh my God, that's so amazing! Like, aren't you scared of, isn't like the grammar like really difficult and like all of this stuff? Like, I've heard it's really hard." Hearing those things might put you off of a language as well. So if you realize that these are sort of products of every person's, not just theirs, but also ours, the cultures and communities that we come from, these are sort of products of those. So if you recognize that and you know how to deconstruct it a little bit and say, okay, yeah, you say that, but I think I can really get it going, that might also be a good way for us to continue in our language learning, at least with motivation. Just a side note, this is not really anything scholarly focused, but more so my little theory. Maybe changing your personality in another language. Everyone says, maybe, when you speak in another foreign language, it's like I'm another person. It's like I'm changing myself. That might be a subconscious way of putting what you think another language thinks about, another way's patterns, and you're sort of emulating that, which sometimes can come out exaggerated, and often, even might even offensive at some points, but that is maybe one way of compensating for and changing your personality that way. So, to get into the last two conclusion slides, what do we as language learners take away from this? So, when we learn a new language, at first we are accessing simply, a new grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation system, but a native speaker of your target language is more than just that. They're a set of, they have a history, they have a culture, they have, often religion and politics and things that affect the way that they speak and how they think about certain things. So you should be too. You should be able to learn these things and sort of access and approaching a worldview. Of course, other speakers in the past might have said that a worldview, what is the worldview of your language? In reality, it's more so a subconscious thing that you just have to assimilate to a certain extent. Of course, if you look at cryptotypes, like Whorf's concepts, this actually helps you master your L2 to a much higher native level in a language. If you can understand the things that are under the horizon of awareness, not just the grammar forms, not just the vocabulary and such, if you look at those things, you can easily, not easily, but with a little bit of effort, learn your target language to a very high level. You can take on those things and sort of understand the culture a little bit more. Of course, there is a caveat to this. You might understand a cryptotype. You might understand it perfectly, why a person says this in this way, in this method. But because of religion or politics or personal preferences, you might choose not to actually take those on. Let's say it's because of a religion or a lack of a religion or something like that. Something that might be considered offensive to your religion. Different examples of that. There are many other categories. You might choose not to assimilate that and not reach sort of native level because it sort of goes against your personal beliefs. That is also a caveat to keep in mind. Of course, zones of proximal development with Vygotsky. If you look at that, this will help you actually learn the height and the low point of where you're learning at the current moment and help you decide, what method should I really be focusing on right now? Should I be reading books? Should I be, taking tutoring lessons? Should I be, doing basic exercises with grammar, etc.? So we learned about just language learning in general. Now, what about polyglottery? What about a lot of different languages here? So we talked about Whorf. Is he the big bad wolf after all? Maybe linguists might say yes after this presentation still, but I would say no, actually. So if we think about thinking for speaking, a language's schema helps us to figure out what you might be doing wrong in a language. It might be saying, I'm taking this Russian pattern and I'm putting it onto English, or I'm looking at this Italian pattern and I'm putting it onto French, something that's, not quite the same in two different languages. Or you can also recognize what you're doing right is right, and that helps you to continue and recognize other patterns too. So things like time, space, rhetorical styles, all of those things are cryptotypic, we say. So, your native language patterns or the patterns of other languages that you speak well affect the patterns that you put onto your new language. So at first you're going to, when you're starting out, you will put them onto your target language, but after a while you learn the patterns and you can grow out of that. So you have to remember to control and correct patterns, always stay conscious of them, and that leads to an increase in the natural flow of your speech and your writing. So, again, native-like proficiency, just to sum up, you must be able to key less and less into your language's patterns and more into the targets over time. If you stay and you improve your grammar and you improve your accent, you improve your pronunciation and everything, you can still people could still tell that you're not native based on certain things that you say, because like an American would say this, a person from the UK might say that. So you can tell sort of where you're from, even if you have all of those proficiency requirements ticked off. And then, of course, you must be aware of the language ideologies both in your community and the community or communities of your target language in order to learn those. So that is all I have here. I'm ready for Q&A if we have time. I don't know how much I went over or did not, but thank you all for listening.
Maybe I have a question. How do you do in languages which have no native speakers? I mean Latin. So I have, as a Czech, another approach as, for example, French or German people. So we are not able to find a common approach.
Sure. So this is funny because I studied Latin for 4 years in high school, so I do understand this a little bit, not to a speaking level, but for translational purposes. I mean, this often applies to modern foreign languages more than, ancient languages or languages without native speakers. However, there are a couple of patterns that you might be able to notice. Of course, with Latin, I would say the best thing that you can do is look at texts written by native speakers. In this case, Julius Caesar, for example, or something like Virgil, or, even something a little bit more colloquial, for example. You might be able to pick up those patterns and figurative speech and cryptotypes from those texts. In a constructed language, for example, Esperanto, a friend of mine over here told me that there's sort of no really, there are at least some sort of best practices in terms of accent and things like that. But it does mostly apply to modern foreign languages with actual culture, like a geographical location tied to it. But you can apply a lot of these things, I would say texts, for example, with Latin. Perhaps, I would say that with Esperanto, for example, maybe over time people might develop these sorts of best practice methods for speaking and ways of, form a subculture in a way, even though it's very global. But I think that the same processes would apply in the situation. Esperanto I'm not super experienced with, but that's the quickest example I can think of. But yeah, if you want to talk about more of it, I'm happy to talk after as well.
I would like to ask, which kind of method do you prefer to use in order to learn a new language when you want to increase your vocabulary and improve your skills in these languages that you want to learn in your career?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Which methods usually?
Do I use personally?
Yes, which one you prefer and you recommend to us to learn the new language or vocabulary and improve our skills in grammar and to...
Well, that's a very tough thing because, language learning is sort of a very individual thing, but the thing that I use mostly, I use grammar textbooks at first. So like I said before in the presentation, the language at a base level, on a surface level, is very grammatical, pronunciation-based, accent, and things like that. I do focus on those things first, but once I reach a B1, B1.5 level, I would, use Memrise. During that time, I would use Memrise, grammar books, YouTube videos, songs, music. Then I would start speaking with native speakers. So the reason why native speakers are so important in your language learning process, of course, again, for living modern foreign languages, native speakers are so important for me because you can use their experience, you could use their knowledge and corrections in the language to understand, like, oh, it's not like English, this is how you say it, and like, this is the historical reason why something might exist, this is the cultural reason, maybe it has to do something with religion, politics, history, anything of that nature. Idioms are a very good way of thinking about that problem. But I focus much more on the base level, the surface level language at first, and then I slowly over time tweak my language to, adapt to how native speakers actually speak the language. And that applies to grammar, it applies to vocabulary, it applies to pronunciation and accent, things that are a little bit different from what you'll see in the book. But that's what I would, I guess recommend. Everyone can find their own way to do it, I suppose, but that's what works for me. Yep. Thank you for the question.
Hello, my name is Abdullah. I'm from Saudi Arabia.
Nice to meet you.
I speak English, Arabic, French, and Turkish.
Marhaban.
Assalamu alaikum, yes. I wanted to say, first of all, suggest everyone introduce themselves when they ask something. Secondly, I would like to ask one thing about, it's a bit of a step back from your presentation, which is basically,
Sure.
I've met in my country, which is a melting pot for the Muslim world, lots of accidental polyglots, people who just by nature of the
Sure.
Hajj and Umrah, this pilgrimage where we have 3 million people come, is there something that makes someone more inept to learn the language, or is it the environment? Because I think they were not methodical.
Sure.
Some of them don't even read and write, but I've seen people with zero education who speak 4 languages fluently.
Sure.
That's
yeah.
all.
Of course. I mean, it's certainly not only, it doesn't have to be a conscious thing. A lot of times I have I do it very consciously. I learn it, with textbooks and grammar and things like that. That's very, purposeful. But for example, I have a Saudi friend. She's from Al-Ahsa, I think, and she learned English simply by reading books and watching TV shows, and it wasn't really intentional. It was just sort of something that she did for fun, and eventually she speaks the language relatively well now. So I mean, like accidental polyglots and things like that. I do notice that a lot of people who learn languages accidentally often don't necessarily speak like a native speaker. Often there's still some patterns that they keep from their native language, but it really depends on your purpose. You have to, I think, to reach native-like proficiency in a lot of cases, you do have to focus a little bit consciously on certain things. You can reach really, really close, even subconsciously, but I think you have to correct those small things. So, of course, you can learn languages in many different ways, consciously, subconsciously. I think there are many ways to do it, but if you want to intentionally become a polyglot in order to learn languages to native levels, I think it takes a little bit of conscious effort. Otherwise, you might have those remainders there. I'm not sure if I have answered the question, but yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. We have, sorry, I have a couple. Oh, yes.
Hi, my name is Henry. I'm from the U.S.
Nice to meet
you
you.
mentioned personalities with different languages.
Sure.
I'd like to know if you experience any different personalities with languages you study. For me, Russian is probably the one that comes to my mind first because I think it's related to the intonation.
Sure.
The stress syllable is spoken with a lower tone, so you don't say здравствуйте, you say здравствуйте.
Right.
And that, to me, seems more almost intimidating. Like, it's a very powerful, like,
Yeah.
как дела? It's it sounds very powerful to me.
Yeah, I think that also goes back to how we, because I'm an American as well. I think that's sort of how Americans are sort of trained, socialized, coming up to think of Russian and Russians. Think of Rocky. I think it was Rocky 3, where the blonde guy goes up to him and he goes, "I must break you," like that. So yeah, of course, we think about it that way, and that actually not even comically affects how we think about the language as we're learning it, and how the patterns that we put and the ways of speaking that we put onto the language. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But I noticed that when I was learning maybe Italian and Russian first, but as I learned other languages, I'm practicing 8 at the moment, 8 or 9. The more that I learned, the less and less I noticed this was a factor. And I think, personally, this is a theory of mine, I think that's more so because basically that at first I was putting views of how I think people speak in that language onto the language, and it came out maybe a little bit stereotyped, a little bit exaggerated, but it corrected as I became more natural and proficient in the language, Italian and Russian being 2 examples. And as I learned new languages, I stopped sort of doing that, like with German, with Luxembourgish, with Arabic. I didn't really do that as much. And you can say that's maybe a good thing or a bad thing, but I noticed that as I became more polyglot, then it sort of became less of a factor. But yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you very, very much. Give a round of applause to this gentleman. I believe he deserves it.